Welcome back, boils and ghouls. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, please hit that like button. Think about getting in the comment section below and letting me know. And if you really enjoy what you see, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. But now it is trivia time tonight in the Controversy Corner. A few years ago, no one really remembered Hawk and Dove, but with their reintroduction into the media in the Titans TV show, I think a lot more people are going to be reading those comics and reading about what happened during their creation. Tonight, I want to dispel a few urban myths that I still hear propagated today, some 30 years later, about a particular incident regarding issue 5 of the 1988 Hawk and Dove 5-issue miniseries by Carl Kessel and superstar artist Rob Liefeld. To do that, though, we need about 2 minutes of setup. So let's get into the infamous Hawk and Dove incident that led to Rob Liefeld not working with DC for over 2 decades. Starting in the field as a teen with Megaton Comics in 1985, assisting with minor tasks, Liefeld quickly graduated to contributing pinups and other material to Megaton by 1987, was even in the process of releasing his own title with the company when they unexpectedly shuttered their doors that same year. Even from these early beginnings, controversy seemed to follow Rob Liefeld almost from day one. Liefeld's capricious attitude hasn't helped earn him many friends among editorial staff anywhere that he's ever worked, and he always seems to inevitably get on the bad side of basically every editor he's ever worked with, and even managed to upset several publishers over the years. As big as his ego might be, Rob Liefeld's sales were almost always there to back up his braggadocio. He leapt from his ancillary work from Megaton, managing to secure a deal with Malibu to publish his creator-owned Youngblood series almost immediately following Megaton going out of business, and then from Malibu to his big break at DC Comics in a matter of less than 24 months. I talked about all of this except for Liefeld's big break at DC in much more detail in the banned comic that started Image Comics episode. If you want to learn more about that, there should be a link or a little icon or something around here if you want to check it out. But his big break at DC is what we're going to be discussing tonight, Hawk and Dove. While his backup work at DC, mostly for Who's Who, obviously didn't draw an extreme amount of attention, following a story for Warlord, Rob Liefeld was offered the Hawk and Dove miniseries with Carl Kessel, and things seemed to take off almost instantaneously for him. Ironically, it was Barbara Kessel, Carl Kessel's one-time wife, who had come across some samples from Rob Liefeld and was impressed enough that when they ran into each other at the San Diego Comic-Con, she introduced Liefeld to Carl Kessel and suggested Liefeld for art duties on Hawk and Dove, not only to Carl Kessel there, but also later directly to DC as well. Carl Kessel was initially impressed with Liefeld's infectious enthusiasm and has said he still can't help but like Liefeld despite the difficulties that they faced while working on Hawk and Dove together. Liefeld seemed well suited for the material after all, and when the first issue of Hawk and Dove was released, these suspicions were confirmed as the first issue sold out almost immediately. Fans ate up Liefeld's hyper-exaggerated poses and overly dynamic style, despite or perhaps because of the fact it was obviously based on other comic book artists rather than any sort of traditional figure work or formal education. At the time, Liefeld was something new and different. People had been looking for something exciting, and Rob Liefeld seems to have come along at just the right time with just the right style. It appeared as though Barbara Kessel's gamble on the new guy was paying off in spades, as sales continued to pick up issue after issue. There was plenty of fan and critic buzz about the series, and things initially seemed all fine and well, but as often the case with Rob Liefeld, trouble was brewing. Behind the scenes, and despite the fact that Carl Kessel's wife, Barbara, was, as I mentioned, personally responsible for recruiting Rob Liefeld, the relationship between Carl Kessel and Rob Liefeld was quickly deteriorating. I should point out here that while Carl Kessel would eventually become quite obviously dismayed about the entire incident, he has never once lashed out or said anything really negative about Rob Liefeld. Over the years, Liefeld has developed a rather sketchy reputation for making powerful enemies and rubbing people the wrong way, and this is most certainly true. but they're mostly editors and other top brass. If you really push most people that have worked with Rob Liefeld, or even other industry professionals that just know him, most people like Rob Liefeld. He's infectiously energetic and upbeat, and it seems like you can't help but just kind of get swept up in his enthusiasm. Although he does have a pretty big mouth and it kind of gets out of hand sometimes. Honestly, the big thing that I think a lot of people harbor a bad attitude about is Rob Liefeld's chronic lateness. From the very beginning, Liefeld has always cut it close with deadlines and just never seemed to get stuff out on time. Later in life, he would usually attribute this to working on too many things at once, and he wasn't wrong later. But at the time he was doing Hawk and Dove, it wasn't that he had a million other things going on. I just think his attention was drifting elsewhere. And Carl Kessel has agreed with me in interviews. Rob Liefeld already had bigger and better things on his mind and wasn't all that interested in drawing Hawk and Dove, other than to get some experience, a paycheck, and most importantly, get his name out there. Liefeld was dead set on garnering a reputation with his then extremely unique stylistic approach and really stepped up his art game for Hawk and Dove. But because Liefeld was still new to the industry, Carl Kessel was assigned inking duties. This is also probably because Barbara Kessel, initially Barbara Randall, became Barbara Kessel between issues 2 and 3 after marrying Carl Kessel. According to Carl Kessel, this was also done as a way of appointing him as a kind of watchdog over Liefeld's art by DC so that he could clean up or correct anything that wasn't quite up to DC's standards. According to Rob Liefeld, Kessel took this job rather seriously and went to town on his pencils. The finished art looks great, in my opinion. It actually looks a lot like Todd McFarlane's inks on Liefeld's stuff for the New Mutants covers, and a few other things not long after this. Kessel really manages to bring out a lot of the strengths of Liefeld's stuff, though this is admittedly at the cost of much of Liefeld's rather unique artistic personality. Kessel's inks on Hawk and Dove aren't quite as exaggerated, and unlike McFarlane's, Kessel's inks do downplay many of the integral aspects that have earned Liefeld equal parts adulation and disdain among fans and critics alike. Reportedly, Liefeld was not pleased with this, claiming the finished art was heavily altered. Carl Kessel has never argued this fact and plainly stated that this is because he was just doing what he was told, fixing Rob Liefeld's mistakes. And there were a lot of them. Though again, I want to point out, Kessel has never said this maliciously, or in fact without someone directly pressing him for an answer. Honestly, Carl Kessel was and still is proud of his work on Hawk and Dove, and Rob Liefeld was instrumental in launching the success of Hawk and Dove to an entirely new generation, and Kessel has never shied away from this. But that would be years down the road. At the time, Liefeld grew later and later submitting his work, and as a result, Kessel was presumably forced to make increasingly more corrections to the art, and the situation was approaching a critical mass as it became harder and harder to get issues out on time and looking good. Remember how I mentioned that I thought Rob Liefeld had other things on his mind? Well, at the same time he had been hired by DC, Liefeld had also been hired by Marvel Comics. In fact, he actually did work for Marvel before he worked for DC. Liefeld had successfully developed a working relationship with Marvel, and it is my guess Liefeld was simply trying to use his position on Hawk and Dove at DC as leverage to attain a more tenable position and negotiate working on a better title at Marvel Comics. Whatever the reasons, while his art was definitely improving from issue to issue, it was also arriving later and later, and Liefeld's head just wasn't in the game. Kessel grew increasingly agitated with Liefeld, and not just for cutting it so close on deadlines. By the second issue of Hawk and Dove, Rob Liefeld was starting to fall behind. By issue 4, things were getting really hairy. Liefeld was scrambling to finish pages, and at one point or another, according to Carl Kessel, Liefeld's pages started showing up without hands and feet. Liefeld expected Kessel to draw them in during the inking process. This might sound rather dubious, but it's important to bear in mind two things. One, Carl Kessel never brought this up in interviews, nor did he ever seem to be trying to insult Rob Liefeld when he did talk about these events. It was only in answer to questions about the subject when asked about them point blank. 2, Rob Liefeld doesn't really draw backgrounds. more often than not, his panels feature extremely sparse or single color backgrounds as opposed to actual settings or surroundings. This is relevant and important because Rob Liefeld expects his colorists to do his backgrounds for him in a lot of cases. While today this is a well-known and accepted fact among those that work with Rob Liefeld, Kessel was not accustomed to this kind of attitude, and I don't think anyone was really happy with the arrangement from the onset despite the title's success. The Hawk and Dove book, and more importantly DC as a company, just did not feel like a great fit for Rob Liefeld. Sales on Hawk and Dove were good though, and there was plenty of fan buzz about the series. While there was certainly mounting tensions and perhaps even some animosity at the time, to my knowledge there was no talk of firing or replacing Rob Liefeld on DC's part, nor did Liefeld attempt to quit or leave. But Liefeld did continue turning in pages later and later. Despite his difficulty with deadlines, with a lot of help from Carl Kessel, Rob Liefeld managed to get the first 4 issues released on time. They looked great, the series was doing well, and with only 1 issue to go, the finish line was finally in sight. As rocky as the road had been getting there, when the art for issue 5 finally arrived at DC headquarters on time around December of 1988, everyone must have been relieved for all of about 5 minutes. And then they looked at the art. Now, most of Hawk and Dove issue 5 is set in a place called the Chaos Dimension, which is this alternate plane of reality. As I obviously am not able to interview Mike Carlin, Carl Kessel, or Rob Liefeld at this point, it's impossible to know exactly when Hawk and Dove would have technically actually entered the Chaos Dimension as indicated by Rob Liefeld's art. But from the looks of things, it would have been the splash on page 3. Following their entrance into the Chaos Dimension, Rob Liefeld had apparently chosen to draw every scene in the comic that occurs there in landscape, so that the reader had to physically turn the comic on its side to read it. Well, this has been done before, it's rare, and I've always thought it was really annoying having to rotate a book to read it. Editor Mike Carlin, who I get the feeling has never really liked Rob Liefeld anyway, apparently agreeing with my own thoughts, was not just annoyed though, he was absolutely livid. Carlin was upset Liefeld not only failed to ask permission, but that he hadn't even bothered to give anyone a heads up about his decision. When the art showed up and he saw it, I don't even know if Mike Carlin bothered to call Rob Liefeld to see if he would redraw it, or if at that point Mike Carlin was just done with Liefeld. What I do know is that Mike Carlin snatched up a razor blade and fixed Rob Liefeld's art, painstakingly reorientating it to read like a normal comic book, panel by panel. According to legend, Carlin meticulously used a razor blade to cut up Rob Liefeld's original art and then paste it up so that it read in a traditional fashion before making a copy of this reconstituted art and calling up Carl Kessel to ink it. In most of the interviews I read though, Carlin states or alludes to the fact he actually made Xerox copies of the original pages and then cut and pasted those up for Carl Kessel to work on. This version of the story makes a lot more sense to me. I mean, even if he was that upset, what if he had ruined a panel? And how would he adjusted the size of the panels and reconstituted it? It just doesn't make sense. In either case, Carlin passed on the corrected art to Carl Kessel, who then proceeded to lightbox and ink the entire issue from those paste-ups by Mike Carlin, and that's the finished product that you see. While this version of the story makes much more sense, it's not hard to imagine where the idea that Mike Carlin destroyed Rob Liefeld's original art came from, though. Carlin was obviously steamed about Liefeld's apparently rogue decision to draw basically an entire comic sideways. This is evident as there's an editor's note discussing these events, if in a somewhat disguised fashion, in Hawk and Dove at the conclusion of issue 5. The editor's note, quote, wishes Rob luck, indicating that he'd most likely either already left or been fired from DC by the time of Hawk and Dove 5's publication. The note says they know Rob Liefeld is going to be one of the, quote, industry's major talents, but it also calls him out for, quote, introducing entirely new situations to an editor who thought they'd seen it all. And also thanks Carl Kessel for, quote, services way above the call of duty for various and sundry assistance during the worst of it. Following with, quote, what's it? We plead the fifth. While far from aggressive, the simple fact the note even saw print is an obvious sign of Mike Carlin's exasperation with Rob Liefeld at that point. But that's Mike Carlin's take on things. What does Rob Liefeld have to say about all of this? Well, from the very first time he was asked about it, Rob Liefeld plainly stated he was simply emulating the appearance of the Chaos Dimension where Hawk and Dove 5 takes place as it had previously been depicted in its first appearance. Karl Kesel retorted that he'd come up with the Chaos Dimension for that issue of Hawk and Dove, and he's stuck to that story for decades. Given Liefeld's growing reputation as somewhat of a problem child, teamed with the fact that the internet was not around yet to directly get information to fans, there was really no way to successfully dispute Karl Kesel and Mike Carlin's version of events, and the Hawk and Dove incident would prove to be the nail in Liefeld's coffin at DC. Honestly, I don't even know if Rob Liefeld tried to fight Carlin or Kesel. He just kind of cut his losses and moved on. I'm also unsure, I don't believe he was technically fired, but within months, Rob Liefeld had made the move to Marvel and was being groomed for what would become his seminal work on New Mutants, where he would introduce the immensely popular Deadpool character before then quickly rebooting the New Mutants under a new title, one that would set a world record for the highest selling modern age comic of all time in 1991 in the form of X-Force #1. People quickly forgot about the Hawk and Dove series, but over time the Hawk and Dove 5 incident became legend. It was often offered up as the undeniable proof that even from his first real professional work, Rob Liefeld was incapable of working with others and needlessly difficult for no good reason. While Rob Liefeld's time at Marvel, 3 years, a miraculous feat given his track record, would prove to be the most fruitful and lasting of his career, his working relationship with Marvel would quickly begin to deteriorate as well. In 1992, he set out with a band of other highly popular artists to start the creator-owned Image Comics imprint. The books, despite selling insanely well initially, quickly fell perpetually behind schedule and began to cost retailers money. As shop owners and distributors both started to trash talk Rob Liefeld as a result, fans started losing interest around the same time because there was no way to know when the next issue was going to be coming out, and sales dropped like a stone. While this wasn't exclusively a problem for Rob Liefeld, it definitely seemed most prevalent with anything he was associated with or working on. He became the poster child for late books, finally and forever, as a result of the Valiant Image crossover Death Watch, where Bob Layton has famously claimed that he literally flew to Rob Liefeld's house and refused to leave until he actually penciled the pages for his section of the series, which Layton was then subsequently forced to hurriedly ink in an Anaheim hotel room. And I'm sure you know by this time what I am going to say next, but if you want the whole story, sound off in the comments section below, and I will make it happen because Death Watch really is an absolutely insane story. Over the years, Liefeld's reputation continued to degrade, and today, especially thanks to the invention of social media, Liefeld's reputation is an absolute train wreck. He'll make a comeback, people will get excited, he'll do something successful at first, then he'll shoot off his mouth and say something that gets people all worked up all over again, and it's back on the Rob bashing bandwagon. I myself can't make up my mind about him. I at once respect the immutable drive and perspicacity that has made him such a pivotal figure in the medium and history of comic books. On the other hand, it seems things just came too easily to Rob Liefeld, in my opinion. I mostly think that he's a rash, impudent man with a wealth of potential that he's squandered for the most part because he surrounded himself with yes-men and sycophants from his infancy in professional comics. But hey, if I could afford to buy someone like Stephen Platt a car to quit Marvel Comics, or afford to build a 3D modeled, full-sized replica of the spaceship from my massively popular comic I was getting million-dollar royalty checks for, that might be another story. My point is, with all the dumb and crazy stuff that Rob Liefeld's done and has been held accountable for over the years, he's become one, if not the most often cited example of problematic artists in the industry, and the Hawk and Dove incident is one of the major things people throw out there. It was early on in his career. He didn't ask anyone about it. His claims about the Chaos Dimension were obviously false, since Carl Kessel had come up with it for that issue of Hawk and Dove. Except Carl Kessel didn't come up with the Chaos Dimension. Rob Liefeld was not lying about it, and he never has. Erik Larsen had done an issue of Doom Patrol, issue 14, with a cover date of November 1988, where the Doom Patrol are transported to, you guessed it, the Chaos Dimension. And yes, while they are in the Chaos Dimension, the art is all drawn completely sideways in landscape. Liefeld and Larsen had been fairly tight since their time together at Megaton, where they were both starting their professional careers, with Megaton 1 being Erik Larsen's first professional work and issue 8 being Liefeld's. It's no stretch of the imagination that Liefeld would most likely have read or at least seen the art for issue 14 of Doom Patrol and chosen to draw the images in landscape to match Larsen's already approved work. The real kicker here, though, when he was asked about the Chaos Dimension issue of Doom Patrol, Erik Larsen quickly remembered it and pointed out something very interesting. He hadn't asked permission to draw it sideways either. No one had flipped out about it, though. No one was upset. He didn't even remember anyone complaining. Larsen wasn't asked to redraw anything, and no one tampered with his art. It was printed with the Chaos Dimension pages intact in landscape. While Liefeld still wears the Hawk and Dove incident like a scarlet letter in the industry, Erik Larsen was never even asked about the nearly identical work that he did for the same company only months before. No one even bothered to grab a copy of the Doom Patrol issue that Rob Liefeld was talking about. They were not interested in hearing him out so much as making an example of him. I'm not a Rob Liefeld apologist. I think there are plenty of legitimate reasons to dislike him if you do, but this shouldn't be one of them. I'm tired of hearing it repeated all these years later and wanted to take a few minutes to disprove this often repeated and yet easily disproven urban legend. Rob Liefeld did not draw the entire issue of Hawk and Dove sideways for no reason. It wasn't even the entire comic, just the majority of the comic that takes place in the Chaos Dimension. He might not have had permission, but neither did Erik Larsen, and seeing as the two were good friends, it's not a stretch to think not only was he aware Erik Larsen had not asked for permission, in his head Liefeld was just carrying on canon from the Chaos Dimension's first appearance in his buddy's book a few months prior. I've never gotten the impression that Rob Liefeld did this maliciously or even to get a rise out of Mike Carlin or Carl Kessel. Rob Liefeld's never really been afraid to speak his mind, and I think if he had a problem with Mike Carlin or Carl Kessel, he would have let it be known long before now. He just drew the comic the way he thought it should be drawn. Mike Carlin didn't like that, and Carl Kessel was completely unaware of the pre-existing construct of the Chaos Dimension as introduced only months before in DC continuity, and for years this story has been perpetuated and completely blown out of proportion in my opinion. I hope this video lays to rest some long-standing misconceptions and sheds some light on a little-known and yet extremely important and pivotal point in the career of one of the most successful and controversial comic book artists of all time. Thanks for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed, maybe even learned something. As always, links to all of my digitally available sources as well as further reading can be found in the description below. If you did like what you see, hit that like button for me, share these videos with your friends, think about getting in the comments section below and letting me know. If you really enjoyed what you saw, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you do that, make sure you ding the little notification bell to keep up with all these videos I manage to get out every few weeks. I know I'm slow. I'm working on getting quicker, but you can at least hope for a full-length video every other week and hopefully some shorter stuff every week starting sometime fairly soon. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, you have any questions about anything I talked about tonight, or you have a suggestion for an episode you'd like to see in the future, think about getting in the comments section below. I try to reply to all of the comments you leave, and not only does it really help out the channel, but I've learned some super cool stuff, and I'm working on a few really awesome viewer suggested videos right now. So think about getting in the comment section and sounding off. Thanks again for sticking with me. I really hope you enjoyed, maybe even learned something. And as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only two things. Keep hitting those local shops and keep reading comics.